a lot of you guys did incredibly well on it. So with that being said, let's get started. So
We have a question.
yes, Tivish?
The nervous system is basically the brain, the nerves, and the spinal cord, right?
Correct. Good answer. You kind of got it. But let's get into it. Shivin, so do you want to
Yep.
get started? Well,
So we talked about really the overarching view of the nervous system, right? So we really talked about what the function of the nervous system was last week. Does anyone want to remind us what that function was?
or what do you know?
To give instructions to the body.
Correct.
Yeah,
But
so the nervous system is like input and output cables to a TV, right? So it sends information to the brain, and it sends information to the brain, and it also gets instructions from the brain and sends it to the rest of the body, right?
I have
The
a
nervous system is like
question.
how the entire body communicates with the rest of the body.
yeah, your question, Tavish?
Like nervous systems also helps communicate when you're hurt, right?
Yeah.
Can frequently send a signal to your brain.
Yep. Because the nervous system is the only thing that tells our brain when we are hurt or when we're bleeding, or basically a lot of things in general. We only know it because of the things that the nervous system is doing and interfacing with the outside environment. So if we didn't have the nervous system, we would be a rotting bag of flesh and we wouldn't even know it, which is kind of dangerous.
Yeah, and talking about hurt, right? The nervous system, right? Sometimes when you get really, really tiny cuts, we don't even notice them until we actually even look at them, right? So once our eyes see that we're injured sometimes, they're like, oh, we're injured. Tell us the brain. Brain's like, oh, you should feel something there. And then like the pain increases. Or if you didn't notice it before, now you notice a pain from there, right? So it communicates with the rest of the body in really, really interesting ways.
Yeah. So let me get us started. So with the nervous system, there's two main subsystems that we're really concerned about. Obviously, the brain is a key component of the system, but even before we get to the brain, there's two main subsystems: the CNS and the PNS, and they work together. And this picture, you probably can't see this picture because it's tiny, but that doesn't matter. We have a better picture. The CNS is what we call the central nervous system. And the central nervous system is what constitutes the brain and the spinal cord. Now, I saw a question in the chat which asked, if your spine is providing support and is a skeletal object that is giving us support in the body. However, the spine is like a special thing with also a bunch of thick nerve connections running from the brain to the bottom of the everywhere around the body. So the spinal cord is also a key component of the nervous system. And I think I also spelled that wrong. Thank you for correcting that, Shivan. So the brain and spinal cord make up the central nervous system. And then the PNS is the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral means like outside. So the PNS also is everything else. So it's connected to the central nervous system and allows the central nervous system to receive input from every part of our body. So like from our toes to our fingertips, this PNS is what connects that and then eventually relays that information to the CNS, which then relays it to the brain. So yes, go for it.
So is the PNS kind of like the muscle?
It's very close to what it does with the muscle because see, Tavish, if you want your muscle to do something, your brain sends a message to the CNS, then the central nervous system, then the central nervous system sends it to the PNS, and then eventually that message is going to reach the muscle, and then we are going to have action happen. So the muscle is like kind of like a dumb thing, like a dumb machine until the nervous system turns it on. Does that make sense?
Oh, I thought the muscle was connected to the PNS.
Oh, it is. Yeah, it is connected, but that's a completely separate system that is connected. It is not part of it, but it is connected. But good observation. So do you want to You want to talk about this, Joan, a little bit? Or should I just keep going?
So we just talked about the CNS and PNS, right? But there's a certain order to this, right? So as I'm sure Adwan mentioned, right? The CNS is made up of the spinal cord and the brain. That makes up the CNS, right? So when your brain receives information, right? For example, let's say you want to move your hand, right? When your brain is like, okay, let's move this hand, it first sends out the message through the CNS, the central nervous system. So it's sending it through the spinal cord, through the nerves that make up the spinal cord. But also remember, there's also a second division of the entire nervous system, which is the PNS, right? And so the PNS, which branches out from the spinal cord to the rest of the body, like to the tips of your fingers and the toes of your feet, right? So then those messages then travel from the CNS into the PNS, and then the PNS transferred into the node. And so the node could be, at least in this instance, it's the endpoint, right? So in this case, it's the arm muscles. So when it reaches a node, or the arm muscles in this case, the arm muscles flex, and it's like, okay, now you've moved your hand. Okay. So messages oh, go ahead.
No, keep going, keep going.
Okay. So yeah, so messages can go either way, right? So if you're hurt if you get stabbed in the hand or something, right? Then you're going to have a bunch of muscles that are hurt. And so then instead of going from the brain to the node, it's going to go the exact opposite way. From the node, it's going to go through the PNS, through the nerves all the way to the spinal cord, and then from the spinal cord into the brain, where the brain's like, oh.
But yeah, as I was saying a little earlier, the brain and the brain can communicate via the CNS, and eventually that will reach the PNS and to the node. That could be a skeletal muscle, which would be moving your arm or something like that. And it can also move up vice versa. And as we talked about it, afferent and efferent, right? Afferent is something that you can, that is being fed to your brain, like data that is being fed to your brain. So the environment around you, the sound, the vision, the sound, the heat, how warm it's feeling, all of that is afferent data being sent to your brain by the sensory parts of our body. If you have water that, if water fell on your skin, you only know that it was water fell on your skin because you get visual afferent data being sent from your eyes, and you also get the receptors on your skin telling the brain that, oh, it's wet. So that is afferent data. On the other hand, the efferent data is things that are being sent from the brain to control something that we may have or may need, right? If I am feeling hungry, the brain can send an efferent signal to the somatic muscle, to the somatic nervous system. Maybe my voice is just lagging.
You're cutting out a tiny bit.
Hold up one moment. Do I sound better now?
Yeah.
That had nothing to do with that, but I just turned off the whirring fans on my computer. So as I was saying, the afferent data that is being sent is the data that is kind of like, how should I put it? What you control, what you do, what you choose to do. So if you commanded your body to walk yourself to the kitchen and pick up a cookie, that is efferent. Those are efferent data that is being sent.
Right, you can see an effect. You can notice an effect. There is an effect being done because of it.
Yeah. So afferent relays data, efferent we send data from the brain. So today our main goal is to actually talk about the PNS and the subsystems in the PNS itself, because we can't explore absolutely everything that has to do with the nervous system. That would take us quite a bit of time. And we're also at the same time, within this unit, we are trying to connect many other non-science or non-bio topics. So the nervous system has a lot of connections with something like a computer, and the brain has a lot of connections with computers and wires and all that. So the thing is that with this unit, we're going to be exploring how lots of technologies like computers and fiber optics and all that, how those things work, we're going to be exploring that from the coming lessons onwards while we explore the human body. So you guys would get a better understanding. So it's definitely going to be really interesting. So let's start getting into the PNS. Do I sound better now?
Yeah, you sound fine.
So with the PNS, there is two main subsystems. You want to talk about it, Shiv?
Yeah. So the two subsystems are like autonomic, right? What word sounds really similar to autonomic? Can you guys think of any words that sound really similar to autonomic?
Autonomous.
Yeah,
Nice.
auto, right? Automatic. That's another one, right? So what does it mean when something is automatic? Can someone tell me?
It does something by itself without like anything like powering it.
Right. It does it by itself. It doesn't need us to do it for it, right? And so that's really similar to the autonomic peripheral nervous system, right? Because in the autonomic division, it's automatically doing these functions it's doing things, right? So for example, one of the things it does is it helps us breathe. It controls a lot of our organs, right? So pumping blood from the heart or breathing in air through our lungs, right? We don't need to think about it for it to happen. It just automatically happens because the autonomic system takes care of it. It's like, you don't need to worry about this. I will do it for you. You can go focus on something else, right? So it's automatic and we don't need to worry about it. But there's also a second division, and that is called the somatic peripheral nervous system. And in the somatic system, what we're looking at is we're consciously moving our hands, right? So if you're at school and you want to hold up a pencil, you think, okay, let's get this pencil. Then the muscles in your hand and arm move and you grab the pencil, right? So we're thinking about it and it's happening. We're controlling our muscles and moving. It's not automatic because you have to think. We have to think to do it, but it is happening. Okay, so just remember, autonomic, automatic. You don't need to worry about it. It'll do it by itself. Somatic, you have to think about it and you have to want to do it in order to have it done.
And the thing is that we want to explore a little, while we can explore somatic, we'll do that at another time. Let's explore the subsystems of the autonomic system today because those are really quite interesting. So autonomic subsystems, and we have three subsystems of the autonomic subsystem, which in itself is the subsystem of the PNS, which in itself is the subsystem of the nervous system.
So many subsystems.
So of the autonomic nervous system, the three subsystems that are in the autonomic nervous system are parasympathetic, sympathetic, and enteric. Now, actually, I'm not going to ask that question because sympathy has nothing to do with this. I still don't understand why scientists call it that. But so with the parasympathetic system and the sympathetic system, they sound very similar, but one is obviously different because of the prefix para. So the thing that we want you guys to think about is one of these systems controls things in the body when we're under stress, and the other one controls things in our body when we're in a relaxed state. And let me try to explain how that would kind of work out. So if you were in let's think about it this way, right? You're going in the woods, you're walking in the woods. Okay, this is Shivan right here walking in the woods. And
Fun.
Shivan's walking by and then he sees, oh, hold up. I'm gonna do something. All right, there we go. Shivan's walking by, and then he sees a big brown thing. Like
That's very vague. Big brown thing.
big brown thing. So the big brown thing is gonna come by, and that is called a bear. And then the bear, if Shivan sees the bear, what is Shivan gonna do? What is Shivan gonna do?
Run away.
Yes.
I'm going to panic, right? I'm like, oh, I messed with the bear. Let me get out of here real fast.
In all reality, Shivan's gonna go up to the bear and be like, Hey, let's shake hands. Hello.
No, I won't. I would stay very far away from the bear.
So the bear, that is, I think that's a decent bear for 30 seconds of
You're having a bit too much fun with this.
honestly. Shimon, honestly, the fact that you're going to the woods next week and I'm going to and I really want you to take a picture of the bear. It's like my dream. That would be a dream. So the sympathetic nervous system kind of kicks in when we suddenly get stressed out, right? So if you're going to run away, you need multiple things. Running requires a lot of energy. So one of the things that the sympathetic nervous system can do is can stimulate rapid release of glucose by sending by sending information from nerves to the liver. So you can simulate rapid glucose release. You could simulate something called epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, which will help you get your whole body running at like high heart rate. It can inhibit your digestive activity, so you wouldn't waste energy on that when you're stressed out. You can increase your heart rate. It can dilate your pupils, so you're really starting to pay attention. These are the kinds of things that the sympathetic nervous system can activate when you're suddenly stressed out. And that's when Shivan's in the woods and he meets the bear, he's gonna suddenly eye bulge, and then suddenly starts breathing hard and probably is gonna go and run. And he needs a lot of glucose when running. So these are some of the things that the sympathetic nervous system does. When you're stressed, that's what's being activated. However, on the other hand, you have the parasympathetic nervous system, and what that is doing, it's bringing things back to normal, right? So a side effect of high adrenaline is actually dry mouth. So if you had a lot of adrenaline, your mouth is going to dry, and it wouldn't matter then. But when you're back to normal and you're relaxing, you'll notice that. So the parasympathetic nervous system sends signals to your mouth to stimulate the saliva flowing. It will bring your pupil back to normal by constricting the size. It will get your digestive system back up and running, and it will constrict and decrease your heart rate, and it slows down and inhibits your adrenaline. So it brings things back to normal and allows you to get back to that homeostasis level of like state of mind. So you're nice and relaxed. So parasympathetic is like bringing yourself back to normal, and sympathetic would be like when you're stressed, you're suddenly doing things. And there's another good there's real life proof of these examples too, right? When a lot of people go to the hospital, if they have a sudden accident, even if they spend like a couple of days, they may not feel the urge to actually need to poop or anything, because their digestive system will just completely shut down for a couple of days in that sudden shock. So when they're only back to normal, will the digestive system start working. In fact, that's why when astronauts travel to the moon, or not to the moon, to the space station, or not the space, yes, the space station, it takes like 2 days, but very rarely do astronauts really need to do anything and outside of getting out of their seat, because they'll be fine because they're in like a stressed state of mind. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So do you guys get the difference between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system now? Make sense? Nice. Kevin, you want to talk about the enteric?
Yes. So the enteric system is actually a bit of a different system, right? So the enteric system is actually dealing with the gut. So it has a bunch of pathways within the gut, and it basically controls like digestion and how the gut reacts and how the gut actually works. So really the enteric is very limited in that it's only dealing with the organs that are in the digestive system, like the intestines and the stomach, okay? And it's a very, very localized and specialized system. But one of the special things about it is that it can act by itself sometimes. It doesn't need to consult the brain when it does something. It can just be like, okay, something needs to be done, I will do it. Which is why it's actually a separate, a really subcategory of the autonomial system.
And a key thing I want you guys to notice is that, do you see the sympathetic pathways in the enteric system? Like I said before, stimulating your digestive activity, whether your parasympathetic or sympathetic system does that, these are the connections that connect that to the enteric system so you can activate or shut down your digestive system. So that's kind of how like the interlinking of all of these systems work. Nice. So at this point, before we really talk about more about this nerves itself, I think we're gonna have quite a bit more time this lesson, Shiva. I think we need to talk about this key skill that we want you guys to realize as we eventually hit on other nerves and then eventually get to the brain. And that's this magical two words called analog and digital. Have you guys heard of analog and digital before? And if you have, what do you think those mean?
Are there like two different types of clocks?
Nice, that is correct. Anything else? Clocks, that is good. Anything else you may associate if something's analog or digital? Krish, go for it.
Like I have an analog clock in my house, but on phones there's a digital clock.
Nice. Yeah, so a lot of clocks, but you are right, because the difference between analog and digital is that, well, with the clock itself, imagine an analog clock is constantly running in the sense that it has things inside it that are moving. It's continuous. But on the other hand, digital clocks, they only change the time, they only make movements and change the time on the screen when the time changes. There's no parts moving inside it like that. And a better way to understand analog versus digital is the clocks example is a good one, but a better way is the bucket example. So the thing is, let's look at the sound wave right here. Sound can be recorded digitally or in an analog manner. And you may not understand what this truly means right now, but let me try bringing in this bucket example. So Joan, do you want to get into the bucket example?
So let's take, for example, that we have a bucket and we want to fill this bucket with water, okay? And so here we can really explore a difference between analog versus digital. So let's, for example, look at digital. In digital, it has two modes. It's either on or it's off, right? So if it's off, there's no water coming out of the faucet into the bucket, okay? But if it's on, it's like turning the faucet all the way on. It can't get any faster, it can't get any slower. It's only one setting. And so the water is going to come out at one speed. And we'll turn it off once the bucket is full, right? So it's either off or on, no other mode. But analog is a bit different. In analog, we're looking at really, we're looking at the bucket, right? So when the bucket is, empty, we put it pretty high because we want to fill it fast. But as it gets closer and closer to the top, we're slowly decreasing the speed from at which the water is coming out from to make sure that we don't overflow, right? So in analog, we can change. We look and we change, and we look and we change. While digital, it's either it's on or it's off. Nothing else. There's no in between.
So I don't know if this example helps, but think about it this way, right? If the faucet for the bucket had like 6 settings, that would be analog. You can vary it at the very beginning. You could be at 6. The faucet could be going at full speed, and then at halfway you can bring it down to 3, then down to 2, then 1, and you can do all that kind of stuff. But with digital, you don't have any of that. It's either on or off, or on and off. No, at least with this example, we're trying to introduce you to the idea that, with analog, you have variance. You can be very varied. There's a there's like the distance between on and off. There can be half on or half off. But with digital, it's either on or off. Does that make sense? Like it's really hard to quantify this principle. Do you guys understand that? Not really. So like you don't get it, I'm guessing, right? Shivan, any other example?
Okay. So
yes, just
the hill.
let's apply the hill. Go for it.
Yes. So let's look at this analog sound wave, right? And let's pretend it's not a sound wave, it's a hill. So let's say we have a ball at the top, right? So if we push this ball, right, and you want it to stop at exactly the bottom of the hill, right? If it was analog, we would start slowing the ball down as it approached the bottom to make sure it stopped exactly at the bottom of the hill, right? So it would be really fast at first, but then we'd slow it down, slow it down, slow it down, slow it down, right? So like from like speed of 10, then to 9, then to 8 to 7, all the way until it stops at the bottom of the hill. That's kind of analog, where we're adjusting it as we need to. But if it's digital, it's like we push it and it goes down at a very constant rate. So it's going down at a speed of 10 the entire time. And it only stops as we hit the bottom.
The way I would describe it with digital is it is moving in the same rate no matter how far you're down the hill. It's always like one movement. So does this make more sense now? There we go. Thank God Jesh told me that.
I know.
Honestly, this is like differentiating analog and digital in a way that it's easy to explain is quite difficult. So do you guys now understand like the difference between analog and digital? Right? Like, does it all make sense? All right. Now let's bring in the example of let's bring in a little bit of computer knowledge, right? So computers arguably are all digital in the sense that there's no analog in computers. At the very basis, computers work off of something called binary, either on or off. And that means zeros or ones. That's all they do. Everything in computers comes down to binary, zeros and ones, and the patterns of zeros and ones can make up a lot of things. But what you need to realize is that of these patterns, the computers, while they're digital, you can do a lot of stuff with it, because even though you only had one speed that you could in this hill, you still went down the hill, right? Even though the analog thing goes down the hill in a smooth manner, the digital thing also goes down the hill too, right? They're different, but you still do the same thing, right? So these are just different ways of conveying the same thing. So analog is very continuous. Digital is very like segmented. Does that make sense, you guys? Now do you really get the idea? Nice. And I would also say that, well, with this, while computers are all digital, and we'll explore a little bit about like how binary works next week, the thing that we want you to realize is that the human body, especially the brain and the nervous system, there's components of it that make the human body seem very digital, very on or off. But at the same time, there's other things that make it feel analog. There's variance. It's like partially on and partially off. Like you can vary it. So the human body is like a mishmash between both. And that's why we say the human body and the brain is a paradigm. Neuroscience is a strange paradigm that's like in between. So as we explore a little more about computers and all that and the brain over the next few lessons, will definitely start making a lot more sense. But now, I guess we're on track this lesson. So, but now let's get into singular neurons. Let's get into the meat and of the lesson.
So this, as you see on the screen, right? This odd looking thing is called a neuron.
Oh,
whiteboard crashed.
I haven't had that.
Give it a second to reboot.
Oh wait, no, it didn't crash. It just blanked out for a second.
Wonderful, right? So this odd looking thing we see on the screen, right? It's called the neuron. And so this neuron is what makes up our nerves. It makes up our brain, it makes up our nerves. It basically makes up the entire nervous system. So let's really break down a neuron, look at what it's made of. So starting off from the left, right, we can see this dark purple circle. That is the nucleus, because the neuron is a cell, right? It's one of the cells in our body, so it has to have a nucleus. On the outside, we have the cell body, right? So it's just like this purple line that outlines the entire thing. And then we have these branch things. And these branch things are what we call a dendrite. And so dendrites are like these basically input areas. This is where the neuron is receiving information. So for instance, if you're trying to pass along information from your eye to your brain, yeah, kind of like a receptor, right? So it's taking in information. So if you were looking at something and we had a chain of these neurons, right, that we would pass on information from each one. And we'll look at that a tiny bit more in a second. So if we move on to the left, right, we see kind of like this, string structure, right? It's just like a long piece of wire, for instance. And this wire is what we call the axon. This axon basically connects the end point and the beginning point, where the end point is what we call the axon terminal, and the beginning point is the dendrite. And this axon is going to take information from the dendrite and pass it on to the axon terminal. And so if you look, right, around this axon, there seem to be what looks like, pieces of pasta, these kind of shells. So these shells are something called myelin. And myelin is a very unique substance because it's actually made of lipids and proteins. It's 80% lipid and 20% protein.
Wait 1 minute, Krish. If you have to go, that's okay. But try to watch the entire lesson. It'll be on the Super Portal. You know how to access that, right?
Yes.
All right, good. Yeah, we'll see you then, Krish.
Thank you.
Bye, Krish.
Yep.
Yep. So this myelin acts as an insulator of sorts, right? So let's take, for example, thinking about a wire that charges your phone. Can someone tell me, what does the insulation do? Why did these charger makers put insulation on the wire? For what purpose did they put them on?
Not to like explode or something? I have no idea.
That's close.
Close.
Really, what's
Make sure the current doesn't get out, right? That's the main function. The number one reason that there's insulation. So good job, Samita. So if you touch a wire with insulation on it, right, you get shocked?
No.
No, right? Because the insulation is protecting us. It's keeping the current inside. But what if there was no insulation and we touched the wire? Would we get shocked? Yes. Yes, we would. And that would not be pleasant. That would be very painful, probably. We do not want to be shocked.
And it's not just that, because imagine the wires also carry data in this form of information, specifically binary. And all of that data that is traveling through the wire, if you don't have insulation and like it isn't made well, the insulation, if you put a magnet near the wire and introduce an electromagnetic field, you're going to then probably interfere with the electricity that is traveling and the data that is traveling down the wire, and therefore you're going to cause some of that data to be lost, and that would stink. So that's kind of another reason why we have insulation on the wires, and especially with certain wires, we really put strong like metal insulation on it. So we'll put like a coating of metal around the wire, and then we will put rubber. The rubber is to protect our hands, and the metal is to prevent electromagnetic interference. So to like not garble the signals up and not garble the information traveling down. So back to the thing, Art. Do you want to?
Yeah. So like as Audubon said, right, protecting data in some instances. This is really what the myelin sheath here is doing, because along this axon, we're sending information, right? So the information that the dendrite received and we're sending on to the axon terminal, this myelin sheath is really protecting the data. It's making sure that the data is not stolen by anything on the outside. And also, it serves a secondary function, and that is, it speeds up that data. It makes the data go even faster so that it can reach the axon terminal even faster. Okay. However, oh, actually no. And these myelin sheaths are made of something called a Schwann cell. And so in the peripheral nervous system, these Schwann cells create these myelin sheaths. But when we're looking at the central nervous system, there's actually a separate type of cell. And it's the, could you scroll up a tiny bit over?
Is that it?
That on the screen. Could you pronounce that?
Oligodendrocytes.
Yes, that.
Oligodendrocytes.
And that produces the myelin sheath in the central nervous system, right? So Schwann cell in peripheral, that thing on the screen in the central. But this myelin sheath is not a uniform thing. It doesn't go across the entire axon. There's actually little gaps. It's like there's little chunks of myelin. And these chunks, these gaps between the myelin sheath are what we call the node of Ranvier. And Ranvier was a French physician who discovered this, which is why it's called the node of Ranvier. And we'll actually look at why we have these chunks, these gaps between the myelin when we look at our next topic. Okay.
And a nice question you asked, Samhita. That is a really good question. The way that metal can shield electromagnetic interference is that, well, the metal acts as like a cage for signals. So anything that's going to come in, anything that is like traveling like as a magnetic like signal, anything that is like radio waves or any kind of interference that could mess with the data flowing inside, those signals would hit the metal insulation and just be bounced off of it. And it's quite outside the scope of the lesson to explain that, but all I can say is like that metal insulation would basically bounce off any of the interference. It would bounce it off, so you don't have the data inside being corrupted and garbled. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Nice. So yeah, so as Shivan put it, those nodes of Ranvier, those are like very good. Those are pauses slightly between each of these myelin myelin sheaths and the Schwann cells. And one thing we want you to keep in mind, Schwann cells are made up of a lot of lipids and proteins, and this allows that's what shields these these axons and these nervous these neurons. So that's how we shield and insulate. That's the body's natural insulator. On the other hand, in outside in the artificial world, we would use something like wood or why are there gaps though? For the way that this wire works, which works through an electrochemical gradient, which we will explore in a bit, because these work not quite like just pure electricity, you need that, and we'll explore why. But in the artificial world, insulators include wood, plastic, rubber, but in the human body, lipids and proteins do that kind of job. So this is really neurons, right?
Yeah, one last thing, right? The axon terminal, that's the end point of the entire thing. This is where these terminals form something called a synapsis, where it passes on basically the information that it has sent, that it has received from another neuron, and it's going to send it off to another neuron so that it can make it all the way down to the brain. So the axon terminal is just the end point of one neuron.
So the thing is that now we should talk a little bit about this. So the thing about how the nervous system works is that, believe it or not, there's a lot of electrical signals in the nervous system, but it also works chemically. So you have electrical signals transmitting information in the nervous system and transmitting messages, and you also have chemical signaling that is doing the job. But only when you look at this diagram, you understand where the electrical and the chemical is coming into the part. So the electrical signal and electrical conduction of transferring messages happens inside happens within a single neuron in itself. So like the length of the axon, that is happening in itself. This is where the electrical signaling is happening. But as soon as you connect one axon terminal of one neuron to another neuron's dendrite, that is where the chemical signaling is coming in. So you have electrical here that in each neuron in itself, and then you have chemical signaling between one neuron and another neuron. So that is why the nervous system works partially in an electrical fashion and also a chemical fashion. It's really, really interesting. And the way that it works, as Shivan said, these work through these things called synapses, the bridges between one neuron to another. And these synapses, they can also be in an electrical format, but we will explore which nerves and neurons can be electrical and which neurons have chemical synapses. But the most common type of synapse is actually the chemical synapse. And while we'll try to explain a little bit of this, it takes quite a bit to understand this. For now, at least, all you need to know is that as that action potential, which is like the electricity flowing down the axon, comes to the very end, that tells molecules in the very terminal of the neuron to suddenly flow, and those molecules are going to then travel to the other neuron's dendrite, and then the dendrite picks it up and then sends the signal down itself. So this is where those molecules are transmitting that data. So does that make sense so far? Everything?
Yes.
Samhita, Adi, are you there? Good.
Yeah.
So at this point, I think it is a little bit of time to talk about also one other thing we want to mention. Not all neurons have myelin sheaths. Some neurons are like uninsulated wires, and that's because some neurons, they don't need it. Some neurons, the ones with myelin sheaths, are extremely important because they need to transfer information quickly, and when it's insulated, you can keep a lot of the information from going on. But the ones that are uninsulated, those are just uninsulated because you don't need the insulation. And you may have some of that information flowing out, but that's okay. So it's really a choice in the body. Certain nerves are myelinated, as we call it, and other nerves are not myelinated. It's just not important. Why? It's just not important. Some of the nerves, why they don't need it. Maybe they just don't do that important of a job. Does that make sense? But let me try to find you a proper reason. Why are Shivan, like, you know, like I am like, why? So some just don't need that high level. Oh, can you guys hear me? One
It's
moment.
better now.
Yeah,
But
you cut out for a second.
I just went quiet. My own voice went quiet. That could be it. Okay. So so as you were saying, why, right? Some neurons, they just don't need that
Is he
level.
frozen again?
What? Can you guys hear me?
Hello, Audubon, you're frozen, right? So as you were saying, right? Some
What?
nerves simply don't need these myelin sheaths because, well, they're not carrying the most important signals. They're not carrying super vital signals. So there's simply no point in creating these myelin sheaths. Much appreciated. Welcome back.
Internet cut out for a second. My bad. Maybe that's. Yep. So where were you?
I was just elaborating on the myelin sheath stuff.
Yeah. So some neurons, Samhita, they just don't need the speed of conduction, that extra benefit. We'll explore why later on in a future lesson, like what genes tell certain neurons to replicate in this way and what tells other neurons not to have myelin. Does that make sense? So at this point, before we actually no, that's not quite important. That doing right now. Okay, so at this point, do you want to get into action potentials a little bit, Jim?
Yes, let me make you host first so you can share the screen.
Which one do you want?
I think I haven't actually seen yours, but let's just go with the one I put.
Okay, nice. Do you see it?
Yes.
All right, you get to be the speaker.
Yes. So the action potential. So let's take a look at this video, right? So in this, we're going to be pause it. Goes pretty fast. So the action potential is basically a gradient. It's a bunch of ions flowing across a membrane, and this is actually how nerves are going to be sending signals across the axon. This is how nerves communicate with each other. They use these action potentials, and let's explore really how does this action potential work. So, have you started? Okay, cool. So first, let's really look at this graph, right? Because this will show us a couple things. So one of the first things that shows us is this first blue line, which has been highlighted for us. And so this actually represents the starting voltage of the cell. And so voltage, all the voltage means is that there's a difference in charges between the outside and the inside of a cell. So on the outside of cell, we actually have sodium ions, and on the inside of a cell, we have potassium ions. And so since we have these,
one moment, let's try to remind them, right? So a little bit about it is that sodium and potassium ions, they're positive, right? And if sodium ions in the inside have this many amount of, if you have like 10 sodium ions in the inside, you have 10 positive charges on the inside. But if you had like 20 positive charges on the outside, you have a higher number of charges, right? Therefore, you have a membrane potential. Back to you, Shin.
Yep. And so that means that there's a difference in charges on each side. One side has more positive charge than the other side. And this results in something we call voltage. And so we can measure the difference in charge using a unit called the millivolts. And the usual potential, the usual number of millivolts is -70, right? So just keep in mind, -70. And the negative is very important. Okay, so -70. That's how the cell usually is. There's a difference of that -70 millivolts. And this is when the cell's all good and all.
It's not going to make a lot of sense until you completely understand it. But just remember, in a normal, relaxed state of the neuron, the inside is just negative that amount. The inside is a little more negative than the outside in terms of voltage. That's all you got to understand. It won't make a lot of sense immediately, but once it does, you'll be like, oh, that's all it was.
Yeah, so the resting membrane potential is -70 millivolts. But it's not always going to stay at -70 millivolts. There's another value that we need to keep in mind, something we call the threshold potential. And so the threshold potential is -55 millivolts. So also keep this number in mind. And the reason why this number is so important is because if we can reach this number, then we start the entire action potential sequence. So there are constantly these sodium and potassium cells that are moving across the cell all the time, right? And so if enough of these ions move across the membrane onto one side, then we can change the voltage. And if the voltage changes so much that it can reach this threshold potential, this -55 millivolts, then we start this entire sequence that we call action potential. Okay.
And if it still doesn't make any sense for you guys, don't worry. You're good. You're good.
Yeah. So then we have 3 separate phases, right? So just keep these names in mind. So the first one is called the depolarizing phase. The second phase is called the repolarizing phase because it's once again polarizing it. And then the last part is the after hyperpolarizing phase. So now let's look at this animation to really look at each of the phases. So as you can see, right, on the outside, we have the sodium ions, and on the inside, we have potassium ions. And, you know, just like this is a throwback to a really, really long time ago, right? We talked about sodium ion, or the sodium potassium pumps, and we talked about really passive diffusion. So just, you know, like a quick review question. Do these ions go from high to low or low to high?
Take a guess, guys. You have a 50-50 shot.
High to low.
Nice.
High to low, right? Good job. So remembering stuff, that's good. So what's happening, right, is we have on the very left, we have this light tealish color. That's going to be our sodium channel. So that is a channel where the sodium ions want to go through. Since there's so many outside and so little on the inside, they're like, I want to go inside. And so they're going to enter through this channel. And vice versa. There's a lot of potassium on the inside that want to go outside. And so there's this this orange potassium channel that they want to travel through.
Yep.
So now let's look at what happens when we're reaching the threshold potential, right? So when you're reaching the threshold potential, we have these sodium ions from the outside. Just here, go ahead and play it. So you have these sodium ions coming from the outside inside, right? And if you notice, here, pause it for a second. If you notice, right, originally these circles on the outside used to be positive, right? They had a plus sign in them, but they've been flipped to negative, which means that the voltage is changing on each side. And so as a result, you can change the voltage of the entire membrane. And once it reaches negative 55 millivolts, we start the process. So, right? So then we have these activation gates. And so basically once its potential changes, all these sodium ions are going to start coming inside, and it's going to continue changing the charges, right? So as you can see, now the inside is almost completely positive, the outside is almost completely negative. And all these sodium ions have come inside, creating a very, very high, very high voltage difference.
Yeah, like a very high positive charge inside.
Yeah. And so this can reach about like 30 millivolts.
Plus, positive 30.
Yeah, positive 30 millivolts. And so once we've reached around that positive 30 millivolts, that's the end of the depolarizing stage. Then the sodium channel is going to close. It's going to be like, you know what, sodium, stop coming. We no longer want you. Then we're going to go to the depolarizing stage. Oh, sorry. Yeah, now we're going to the depolarizing stage. And so if you notice, right, the thing blocking the orange channel is now open, which means that the potassium ions can now go outside. And so now the voltage is once again dropping, right? As the outside is becoming negative or positive again, and the inside is becoming negative again. So now it's all dropping again. And it's going to really approach it's going to reach the resting potential. And actually it's going to really cross, it's going to go close to like negative 90 millivolts. It's going to go a little below the resting potential. And so now we are in the after polarizing stage. And so what's happening in this stage is now both of these channels are closed. And so now we're going to use something called the sodium potassium pump. So here, pause it for a second. Does anyone remember where we talked about the sodium potassium pump before? Does anyone remember it?
Is that like the pumpkin thing? The pumpkin shaped thing?
That is ATP synthase.
Yeah, that's ATP synthase.
Oh, yeah.
We talked about this when we were talking about, you know, passive and active diffusion, right?
But you do bring up a good point because you need ATP to drive this pump, by the way.
Yeah, right. So here we're trying to kick out these sodium ions into areas of high, where there's a lot of sodium ions, right? So we have to use energy in order to go from, instead of high to low, now we're going from low to high. So now we have to use energy to kick these out, to go against the gradient. which is active transport, if you recall. So now the cell is going to use active transport in order to once again to reach the resting potential of about negative 70 millivolts.
Yep.
And now this potassium is going to come inside. And some of the potassium will also come through this additional leakage channel. So there's both passive and active going on at the same time. And so now as everything goes back to normal, the potential is once again going to reach the magical negative 70 millivolts that the cell likes to be at. And so now the cell's like, okay, now I'm back to normal. Now I'm ready if another neuron sends me a signal that allows me to reach this threshold number, I can go through this entire process again. Okay.
So does this make sense to you guys?
Yes.
Okay. So the
Yeah,
thing
this is a really difficult topic. So if you have any questions, please ask away.
Yeah, and the thing is that you may understand the topic in the sense that yes, that is the good point. That's the question that you bring that up. You may understand the process in itself, but you may not understand why it's happening like that. And you're right for asking that, because the way that is doing, and am I back to the whiteboard?
Yeah.
All right. The reason we get that sudden, that is to transmit signals within the axon in itself. But to even attract that to happen, we need those molecules by the neurotransmitters between one set of axon terminals and one set of dendrites. These transmitters these transmitter molecules are the things that start the entire process in general and start the negative 55 action potential. The negative 55 millivolt, what do we call that again?
Negative 55 threshold potential.
Yeah, that threshold potential. So when one neuron has sent a neurotransmitter molecule from another neuron, you get to the threshold potential, and then you start sending the message in that neuron in itself. Does that make sense? And by communicating that message through a bunch of hundreds of these millions of these neurons, you can eventually reach something like a muscle, and then you can tell the muscle to do something. However, this stuff happens in milliseconds. This stuff happens so quickly, you don't even realize that it happens like this. So that's, yeah, so that's a little bit about it. But these,
and there's this one last thing I would like to mention. Here, scroll back up to the neuron diagram. So earlier we said that there's an important function that the node of Ranvier plays, right? And so basically these action potentials basically occur from one end of the myelin sheath to the other. It's not from one end of the axon to the other. That's like a general idea. But what's actually happening is from one end of the myelin sheath to the another, that's like the starting and ending point. And so at each node of Ranvier, we're restarting the process. So that's why we need these gaps between the myelin sheaths, because these ion channels exist that allow us to restart the process every time there's a gap.
Yeah, so like the way I put it is every time you see that node of Ranvier, you have a new set of these ion channels. Would you put it like that, Joe?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Yeah, so that's the best way I would say to understand why we have those gaps too. It's to like get the system, get the whole thing started again. So do you guys notice how like amazingly complex a neuron is? While it technically transfers messages, it's such a complex system. And it's amazing too, because we will eventually explore this, but you know, the way that people get paralyzed is when there's something that is one of the ways that could happen is using this bacteria called Clostridium botulinum. And what could happen is that could block that neurotransmitter, and it could block that signal from transferring. And you know that if a person gets that kind of bacteria in them there's many sources that could happen. It could block that neurotransmitter and then paralyze them the whole way down. None of their neurons work anymore. So the body in itself and biology is such a fickle system. It's so many things are very like tightly and carefully controlled, and there's many ways to mess it up too. Does that make sense? It's very interesting how bacteria and viruses can cause systems to stop working. It's actually quite cool. So at this point, I think